people are constantly raising the bar.
Sacrifices need to be made.
What would you guys say are your biggest weaknesses?
You are your enemy right now.
It's success or die.
Just a fucking podcast.
Hey guys, welcome to the Hypertrophy Hustle Show. This week I'm speaking to Jackson Peos. So this is for the second time. We had a very, very, very good first interview because basically what we talked about was what Jackson's doing his research in and all kinds of things around that. And that was a really interesting interview. But then I thought, what I see Jackson sort of talk about quite often is things around sort of obesity, adherence, all those kinds of things. So I thought I'd drag Jackson back on to talk about this kind of stuff. And basically the premise of today's conversation is mainly going to be around obesity and sort of treating it and sort of figuring out like a wide range of topics and a lot of things that I think will be very interesting for myself because they're questions that I myself have around these sort of things that I find are scary. Sort of like I find the topic of obesity quite scary, and I think it's like such a prominent topic that we need to solve. I mean, if we can, but get closer to solving it if we can. Yeah, and I think So, in terms of this, Jackson, with obesity, a lot of the time we sort of phrase it as an obesity epidemic. In your eyes, is this the case? How bad is it? All that sort of stuff.
I think we can call it an epidemic. I wouldn't call it a disease in respect that sort of it's inherently sort of obtained via sort of your genetics. I think it's fairly almost completely due to lifestyle factors. Now, I'd agree that we can call it an epidemic just because the way that we've seen it progress in society over sort of, say, the last 20 to 30 years. And in terms of sort of the way that companies and corporations producing food products and the choices they've made, over the last 20 to 30 years, we've seen sort of this overwhelming increase in sort of cheap, low-cost, highly palatable, micronutrient poor, extremely energy-dense sort of food options that are readily available. And 40 years ago, we didn't have sort of as many of those options at our disposal, and this is sort of exacerbated the effects of obesity to some degree. The principles of gaining fat and the volume of fat that would cause obesity, still the underlying principle is still a caloric surplus, a chronic caloric surplus over time. But I think the way society has adjusted sort of availability of food and food selections that it makes the potential for overeating and overeating to a significant amount sort of much more likely.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because, say, a year or two ago, when I was sort of getting into this evidence-based space, my first sort of thought was, oh, there's just some people that are lazy. There's just some people that can't handle it, blah, blah, blah. But I think, like, okay, if we take them back 10,000 years ago, whatever, most of them probably wouldn't have been obese, and that's, I guess, just due to the product. It's a product of the environment we live in. Where would you see the main sort of causes or things that contribute towards this?
I think the key to sort of managing obesity on a worldwide scale is finding ways to essentially manage a person's drive to eat. Now, like I was talking about before, with these micronutrient poor, highly energy dense, highly palatable foods, they're not very satiating, but they taste really good, and it doesn't really have a profound effect on suppressing the drive to eat, and this causes sort of an increased potential for just overeating and sort of establishing a chronic surplus over time. Now, when dealing with obesity and trying to manage it, the there's a couple of ways that we can sort of manage their drive to eat. One way is sort of establishing sort of ketosis using a very low energy diet or a ketogenic. I don't recommend this as a place to start. There's also another few options that we can look at. For one, we know that higher protein diets are more satiating, so this can also improve adherence. And probably the biggest key is designing a diet or sort of some sort of nutritional instruction that's tailored to a person's dietary preferences, but still meets the nutritional requirements of sort of the phase or the objective. Now, there's some other smaller impact factors that are sort of usable. Some of these include increasing dietary fiber, which is shown to reduce energy intake. I also think that some form of self-monitoring is important, whether that be girth measurements with a tape, skin folds, or even just morning body weight. That's been shown in the research to help adherence also. There's also data to show that meal planning or prepping can increase the success of weight loss, probably because it reduces frequency of sort of these unplanned meals and sort of unplanned binges and whatnot. Now, there's some other considerations for sort of dietary composition and how it should be tailored for an obese person trying to lose weight versus a normal weight person trying to lose further weight, and we can dig into some of those if you'd like. Yeah, do you want me to go into it?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, so the differences between macronutrient splits and sort of composition for people with obesity and people with normal weight designed to lose weight are not all that different. Now, the basic keys, firstly, to managing obesity are probably twofold. Now, number one is obvious, and it's manage total caloric intake. But you can't just tell someone with obesity to eat less because that's like telling someone with depression to just cheer up.
Right, yeah.
Yeah. And secondly, I think another key factor when managing with obese clients or people with overweight specifically is you want to manage the fat content in the diet because we know that overconsumption of fatty foods are very energy dense, poor for satiety, and they can lead to relatively faster weight gain because the free fatty acids are the primary substrate for lipid synthesis.
Right.
So I recommend for overweight individuals to restrict daily fat intake to 20 to 30% of total calories.
Right.
One, because it limits the potential for more rapid weight gain. And two, because it limits food selection in such a way that the client has to restrict intake of quote-unquote high-fat junk foods,
right.
which in itself can have a profound effect on reducing daily energy intake. And this can sometimes even be enough to establish a calorie deficit on its own. Now, I think it's also wise to restrict intake of saturated fats, which is usually achieved anyway by just bringing down total daily fat intake to 20 to 30% of calories.
Right.
Because, excuse me, because these types of fats, and this has been shown in the research, are typically more inflammatory than unsaturated fats and are known to interfere with the insulin signaling cascade. So they might, again, quote unquote, be unhealthier than unsaturated fats.
What do you mean by the insulin signaling cascade? Does that have something to do with sort of the drive to eat? In terms of the insulin signaling cascade, I'm talking about when someone consumes calories, the body releases insulin in response to those calories as a method to store those calories in either muscle cells or fat cells. Yeah.
Now, in a very efficient system, we need sort of a smaller amount of insulin to put those calories away. Now, when I'm talking about saturated fats interfering with the insulin signaling cascade, what I mean is that they tend to show signs of insulin resistance, which means that small amount of insulin that was able to store the nutrients previously now requires more insulin to have the same effect. That's what I mean by that. Now, there's also another cool thing, just when we're just talking about people with obesity, there is an observed relationship between micronutrient deficiencies and obesity. Now that's counterintuitive because we'd expect that these guys are eating the most, right?
Yeah.
Now, it's most likely due to food source selection.
Right.
So with that in mind, it's likely that when you're working with an obese patient, you're probably going to be increasing their fruit and veg intake substantially. And if that's not viable, then looking at some form of supplementation. Now, with protein, I touched on this before, but we can say with relative certainty that higher protein diets tend to be preferential to lower protein diets from at least a satiety standpoint, and likely lead to reduced post-weight gain after the diet. So the high protein diet for obesity recommendations still stands. These obese patients, they don't have to worry so much about trying to retain lean tissue, but assistance with appetite management can be very valuable. So some people might wonder, so how high? Typically, you go on the lower end of recommendations per kilo of absolute body weight, just because of the disparity between an overweight individual's lean mass amount and total mass amount. So somewhere around 1.6 to 1.8 grams. That's assuming it's in a deficit. Now, with a lean person, that could go up to somewhere around 2.6 or 2.7 grams per kilo of body weight. So you tend to go on the lower end of that spectrum.
Right.
Now, 1.6 to 1.8 grams per kilo of body weight might not sound like a lot, but for a client who's sedentary and overweight, this can sometimes be a huge increase in what your patient or your client was previously consuming. So as a practitioner, you need to have that in mind. You can't just take them from 80 grams of protein a day to 200 and expect them to just be able to click onto it like that.
Yeah.
So sort of summarizing that, you want protein to be high, fat to be moderately low, and so the leftover is carbohydrate. Now, we want the majority of that carbohydrate to be coming from fruit and veg to repair those micronutrient deficiencies that are often seen in people with overweight. Now, the only other recommendation I'd probably have in regards to carbohydrate is to side on the lower end of the glycemic index.
Right.
And that's because the research has shown that these sort of lower GI carbs, they tend to be more satiating. And there was a paper, I think it was by Hall and colleagues, and they showed that a low GI carb diet was effective in reducing weight gain after major weight loss compared to sort of a calorie matched, carb matched, higher GI diet. So that's a very important consideration because as a society, we don't really have a problem with losing the weight. We can, like you look at the Biggest Loser, we can have people losing like 50, 60 kilos of body weight. And then in those sort of retrospective analyses, when they follow them up sort of years later, you see that sort of 90% of the weight has been regained. And you sort of ask yourself, well, what was the point in losing the weight in the first place? So strategies for weight maintenance after the diet are probably even more important, if not as important, than sort of the weight loss strategies itself.
I think it's fascinating stuff because I think with, like, for instance, with the high carbohydrate, high GI versus low GI carbohydrate, for a while we sort of like, I feel like a while ago we got to a point where we were like, okay, calories, sugar's not the devil, but then it's like, now I think we need to sort of track back a little bit, and I think you're doing a good job of sort of being like, but like fruits and vegetables, etc. It's like I think in bodybuilding we're very quick to a lot of us are very quick to sort of be like, calories, yep, that's it. But it's just like, I don't know, obesity is such a complex thing with so many factors that and like all we're trying to do is achieve adherence to a calorie deficit. But it's like we can't tell them that. We can't just be like calorie deficit and then they go off and do it, like, because it's just there's 18 layers to achieving that. One thing that I found really interesting that what you said was sort of if we limited something like the saturated fat or the high GI carbs, and I feel like that can have an influence on their sort of limiting the amount of junk food they're allowed, or quote unquote junk food. It's like, do you feel commonly like what I've observed, or what I think I might have heard someone say it somewhere is you'll have the there'll be high carb but also high fat meals that contribute primarily to the hyper-palatability, etc., and then those will be low in protein, low in fiber, etc. And then when limiting those, So if I've got that correct, of sort of that be creating the hyper-palatable environment, when limiting those, with an obese, sort of a client with obesity, do we want to, how flexible and how rigid should we be in sort of our guidelines? Because a lot of the time we're trying to tread the line of, if we restrict them too much, then they'll binge. But if we give them too much flexibility, then they won't be able to adhere. And it's sort of like, I don't know, do you think how many of these people should be tracking calories? Like in this situation, it's very hard to figure out where to pin them on that sort of spectrum.
Yeah, that's a super tough question, and it doesn't really have a blanket answer for sort of all people struggling with obesity. Now, in terms of sort of whether people with overweight should be tracking, most likely, if a client's come to you struggling with weight issues, and they've got sort of a BMI, they're an untrained person with a BMI as a male of sort of in the 30s or something like that, so profoundly overweight, it's very unlikely that they have any experience or knowledge with sort of nutrient composition of the foods that they're eating. Now, trying to get them to go from that stage to sort of being a MyFitnessPal ninja and tracking everything and hitting like those three numbers is just extremely non-practical.
Yeah.
And that's typically why if I'm working with someone struggling with overweight issues, I'll tend to simplify things a lot more because if you overwhelm them with too much information, it can often cause sort of this negative response and this anxiety and this overwhelming sensation where they don't know what they're doing and they don't understand it. So there's two ways that you can go about it. Now, one way is to set them up with a meal plan. Now, there's a lot of stigma attached to meal plans. It's like, meal plans and it's chicken, broccoli, and rice 4 times a day. Now, a meal plan doesn't need to be like that. Now, you can, during your consults with the client, you ask them a lot about their dietary preferences, sort of how much they like to eat, when they snack, sort of what are the foods they like and what do they dislike, and you can create sort of at least some sort of menu that can be a really good starting point to give them an idea of sort of like you yourself as the coach, you know the calories, you know the protein, carbs, and fats, but they don't need to know it.
Yeah.
And it can give them a really good idea of what a normal day or a quote-unquote good day of dieting would look for them. And it just takes out that sort of that decision fatigue and that potential for them sort of getting overwhelmed and sort of just falling off the program because it's too much information at one stage. Now, you can even simplify it much more than that, and you can, because you got to remember that sort of with people struggling with obesity, small changes, very small changes can often have a profound effect. Like I don't think many of us in the athletic community appreciate sort of how bad some of these diets were previously.
Yeah.
Now, this can be as simple as setting up sort of at least not a specific meal plan, but a schedule of eating. So you can say you're going to have a breakfast, a lunch, and a dinner, and you're only going to have 2 snacks. And you can have a morning tea and an afternoon tea. Now, this can be a huge difference for many people who could just be like endless snackers throughout the day. And you look at the research, you see that sort of frequency of snacking is far higher in obese populations versus non-weight populations. Then you can give some other guidelines. You can say, okay, I want you to have a palm-sized serving of protein. Now, this requires some education from your end as well. Palm-sized serving of protein, half a hand size of some form of carbohydrate, whether it's rice, carb, bread, something like that, and a piece of fruit and some vegetables. I want you to have that 3 times a day, and I want you to have 2 snacks a day and no more snacks on that. And that can sometimes be a 40% decrease in their previous caloric intake. Like I don't think you don't need to have an extremely advanced meal schedule and extremely precise macronutrient targets for these individuals because often some sort of minimal changes can really have a profound beneficial effect. Now, another way you could do it is by restricting essentially a nutrient, whether that's carbohydrate or fat. Now, this is a very basic recommendation, but often it's very easy for the client to comprehend and understand, and the ability for them to have those highly palatable, high carb, high fat meals. It essentially wipes out sort of a portion of the food group that they're not able to have because they can't have cheeseburgers and things like that. So it doesn't really matter whether you say, okay, we're going to do a low fat, higher carb diet or a higher carb, low fat diet or a ketogenic diet or something like that, where you're restricting one of the nutrients quite significantly, because it just reduces the ability for essentially junk food eating. Now, we can probably tie this onto a little bit of a discussion about the ketogenic diet. Now, we've got to keep in mind that sort of the Western diet is, when looking at sort of observational data, it's tend to be composed of around 55% carbohydrate. So for an average person, that might look like 200 to 350 grams of carbohydrates a day. Now, reducing this to 20 to 50 grams a day on a keto diet is a surefire way to establish calorie deficit. We also know that high intakes of sort of carbohydrate-dense, sugar-laden food is associated with somewhere around 45% increases in the chances of obesity. Right. Now, that's not because there is anything inherently fattening about these sort of carbohydrates, but it's just because they're not very satiating, they're highly palatable, and they're just so easy to overeat. So taking carbs out, just like we talked about taking fats out, can be an easy way to mitigate that risk.
And I think it's interesting because it's like, I find people will commonly jump to those sort of situations. They'll commonly jump to the keto or whatever, and then it's a very, I don't know, it's the thing that I'd like to sort of cycle next to is the issue, I guess, becomes there is I find commonly my experience has been it's easy to adhere to at the start, but then if you lose all the weight and then you have to, I guess, get off it or live a normal life again, that's where the trouble starts. And it seems as though, let me know what your experience has been here, but it seems as though there's sort of issues, like say, if we take keto, for example, issues even reintroducing carbohydrates and sort of reactions to them. And like reactions is maybe a strong word, but like not like the gut and such not really tolerating them that well. And then it being hard to even go back to a normal diet or takes a transition period. Would you say that's sort of been true in your experience?
Correct. So there's psychological and physiological. So essentially this circles around sort of the downsides of sort of a very high fat, minimal carbohydrate diet. Now, psychologically, the downside is, like you said, like compliance seems 16-week, 20-week studies. But is this a dietary choice that's sustainable over a lifetime? And it's just almost certainly not, because you try and tell a client, let's say you're an advocate of the ketogenic diet, let's try and tell a client that they can never go out. What are they going to never go out to a restaurant meal? Like what sort of restaurant meals, unless you're going to like one that's like Health Freak has specialized like keto options or things like that. Like 99% of restaurants will not offer sort of ketogenic options. So what are you supposed to do? Never have a social occasion with your friends and family for a birthday, or are you supposed to pack your eggs and bacon and butter in a Tupperware container? Like it just does not seem pragmatic to me. Pragmatic to me whatsoever. Now, the physiological downsides are also quite significant. Now, there's this term that gets thrown around a little bit called metabolic flexibility, and not too many people understand it correctly. But in basic terms, what it means is your ability to transition between oxidizing fat for fuel and oxidizing carbohydrate for fuel. Now, with someone who's very metabolically flexible, which is the ideal situation, they can switch between the two just fine. Now, when you go to a ketogenic diet and you've established ketosis for some period of time, it's shown that metabolic flexibility gets significantly worse. You get really great at oxidizing fat for fuel and extremely poor at oxidizing carbohydrate for fuel. Now, this could cause some issues when people sort of transition from a keto diet to trying having a normal balanced diet. So let's say like a standard Western diet, which is 55% carbohydrate. Typically, there seems to be notable oxidation issues, and that these carbohydrates are just not getting metabolized as efficiently as what they were before the ketogenic diet. Now, this sometimes reinforces some of the belief in the ketogenic diet, because someone will go on a keto diet for 16 weeks and then they will transition back to a normal diet and they'll just find that they don't feel great, energy's crap, performance is bad, just because they're not efficient at oxidizing carbohydrate anymore. So they're like, oh, I knew carbs were bad, I need to go back to the ketogenic diet, and it just sort of, you get stuck in this vicious cycle. Now, another issue is sort of relates to this enzyme called pyruvate dehydrogenase, and essentially it's involved in sort of the storage of carbohydrate in muscle. Now, this becomes an issue. This has been discussed a lot in sporting contexts around like MMA fighters who are doing like weight cuts and because typically what someone would do as an endurance athlete is potentially try an extremely low carbohydrate diet to try and maximize capability of oxidizing fat for fuel, which is essentially a more abundant fuel source. It sort of has a endless depot of fuel available. So essentially, if you could tap into this, it could be glycogen sparing and whatnot. Now, with MMA fighters with really aggressive weight cuts, sometimes they will take carbohydrate to sort of minimal or no consumption of carbohydrate sort of in the lead up weeks to a fight, and then they'll weigh in, they'll make weight, and then they'll try to replenish these carbohydrates back in. This is seen also with some Tour de France riders where they'll train a lot going into a race on low carbohydrate diet, and then they'll start trying to carb load before an event. Now, we get this. What we see is we get a down regulation in this PDH enzyme, which impairs our ability to sort of shuttle the carbohydrates to where they need to be used as sort of glycogen as fuel. So essentially, you become worse at carb loading. So yes, you're better at oxidizing fats, but when you try to sort of transition out to sort of a glycogen storage phase, which you need a certain amount of a significant amount of glycogen, particularly if you're doing some sort of activity with high intensity efforts like an MMA fight or a Tour de France race where you're climbing up hills and things like that, where carbohydrate needs to be the predominant fuel source. You're essentially shooting yourself in the foot with respect to that, because your ability to use and store the carbohydrates is now compromised due to your ketogenic or low carbohydrate diet before that.
Do you personally feel as though it has much application? Do you feel like it's like how many times out of 10 should it be the first port of call? I would say probably not, but like how many times? Is it the individual's preference that sort of changes that, or where does that lie?
Yeah, so there's like we talked about some pros and some cons of keto diet or very low carb. Now, with that being said, I just wouldn't recommend this as my first protocol unless the client had some huge distaste for carbohydrates or something like that.
It would have to be pretty sort of extreme, because I feel like there's so many more conservative measures we can use. It's like, for instance, I'm currently on my podiatry placement, and there's orthotics, right? They work, they are good, but it's like there's shit that does the same for many conditions in many cases, and not all podiatrists do this, but hopefully more podiatrists should. It's like we don't need to go straight to orthotics. We can go fucking like we can go like 3 steps down the road, where we just add a little felt thing and it changes pretty much everything. It just changes a tiny thing. And I feel like this is a similar case. It's like keto feels like such an extreme thing to do, and why can't we just like, hey, increase vegetables, give them a meal plan, or try some of the sort of the basics, lay down just a few basics, and I feel like it's an interesting situation we've got now because everyone's sort of got on the train, then got off the train, and getting off the train, and it's intriguing.
I think it's worth me just talking about why people were getting on the train, specifically for people with obesity. Now, the argument that surrounds the keto diet being beneficial for people with obesity usually circles around this concept of insulin resistance or glucose tolerance, meaning those with obesity have poorer insulin sensitivity, and thereby by reducing carbohydrate and the subsequent insulin release, that you can restore some of that sensitivity to insulin and reduce risk of type 2 diabetes, which is a big issue for people with overweight. But in a meta-analysis where they looked at sort of low carbohydrate versus low fat diets that ran for longer than 12 months, that was meta-analytic data. They showed that there were actually no differences in glycemic control, which sort of refutes the hypothesis of sort of a ketogenic diet having more application for people with obesity, which quote unquote have poorer insulin sensitivity. And what we need to remember is that sort of weight loss independent of the macronutrient split is going to have the most profound effect on improving sensitivity to insulin.
So would you agree with the sort of, I was talking to Danny Lennon yesterday and we sort of were thinking a little bit about this, and would you say, in your view, and this is sort of what I've come to believe, in terms of things like diabetes, insulin sensitivity, for those who don't know, insulin sensitivity and insulin, like in a way, insulin resistance leads to type 2 diabetes. So it's sort of, they're very closely tied together. Hopefully I've explained that well. But it's like, do you also sort of agree with the premise of it's probably more just the high calories, energy availability, and we're never really, the glucose in the blood doesn't really have anything to go to, and it's always there, like it's consistently there, and it's not because, like the glucose in the blood, would you say, is not just there because of carbohydrate, I guess?
Absolutely. Like it pisses me off that there was this observational study, huge study, and it was, I can't remember, maybe 5 or 10 years. The consumption of sugar-sweetened beverages and like sodas was highly associated with obesity and type 2 diabetes. Now, that is not because the sugar in sodas or sugar alone has this inherent devilish effect on insulin sensitivity and sort of fat gain. It's just because this is observational data, which means they're not manipulating anything. They're just looking at relationships. Like, isn't it just so likely that the people having lots of sugar-sweetened beverages and Cokes and lemonades are probably also adopting other unhealthy eating and dietary practices and probably not having the most optimal sort of training schedule and probably low levels of activity? Like, doesn't that make more sense? Now, I published a study which it was only released a couple of weeks ago, and it was on rodents, which people are like, oh, it's rodents. But the one good thing about rodent studies is we know exactly what the rats are eating. Now, whenever you're doing sort of studies with humans, sort of you can give them macronutrient targets, but we know that adherence, particularly when working with obese people, can sometimes be sort of adherence can be extremely poor. Porting of sort of caloric and macronutrient intakes can be sort of extremely erroneous and sort of have high error margins. So the benefit of rodent studies is we know exactly what they're taking in. Now, they wanted to see which type of diet sort of most exacerbated sort of signs of metabolic disease or something associated with the obese phenotype in humans, so like insulin resistance and whatnot. Now, they gave half the rats a high sugar diet, and they gave the other rats a calorie-matched high fat diet. Right. And they actually showed that the high fat diet had a poorer effect or a more significant effect on insulin resistance than the high sugar diet. Now, people will think you're like, oh, well, that doesn't make sense. We thought sugar was the thing that causes diabetes. That is not wrong. That is not correct. It is the chronic caloric surplus over time that has the biggest contributor to weight gain and therefore insulin resistance. Now, when you look at the data, it actually showed that sort of the high sugar group had less weight gain than the high fat group. Now, this is counterintuitive to what sort of the lay public and sort of lay media would lead you to believe.
Yeah.
And my sort of interpretation of that study was that because the high fat chow that the rodents were eating is the most energy dense, it's possibly they were eating a little bit more of it, or eating the same amount of volume of food, but sort of for a higher caloric intake, and this was then sort of exacerbating the symptoms. So I think people need to understand that if you're on a high-fat diet or a ketogenic diet plus for long enough, you will develop signs of insulin resistance, and if it continues to a big enough scale, signs of diabetes in the exact same way you would if you're following a high sugar, high carbohydrate diet that has established chronic surplus.
Yeah, I think that's an insanely interesting thing, because I think like my university, AUT, rep it, I think we're pretty good, but it's like,
you got a dope university, dude. I've been there.
Yeah, it's great, man. I'm hyped to go to this university because we have some. It's like I was just listening to Eric talk about it.
Your sports science facilities shits on ours. I'm not kidding.
Yeah, I've never been there, but man, I'm hyped.
Yeah,
hoping to go into masters next year, and fucking hell, so hyped, but it's like we're a good university for this shit, right? But it's like I don't know. I'm doubtful. So basically, like, it's very hit or miss whether even lecturers believe in the premise of calories in, calories out for controlling weight gain. And like, fuck, the whole like thing about sugar carbohydrates causing insulin resistance, like, I get that. Like, I get how you could still sort of, like, that seems to be quite early stuff. Like, it's where we're not, like, that's not going to get down to the lay people for another few fucking years. But I don't know, like, as a lecturer, for instance, in podiatry, it's like we deal with so many patients with obesity. It's like, man, like, all the shit is caused by obesity. I've talked about it so many times. It's like, that's like such a fucking common thing. Like, so many things in health, obesity. And AUT, one, we're really good for exercise science and sports science, but what we're also really fucking good at is health. We fucking crush it. Like, we have a campus, North Campus, which is like nurses, physios, podiatrists, OTs, tons of shit. That's just all health. And like, I feel like if you asked half the lecturers, I don't know what percentage would be like, calories control weight gain and loss. And I don't know, to me, like, okay, I hope it would definitely be interesting, be different if you talked to the more sort of nutrition-based, exercise-based side of it. But I feel like what's really scary to me is the fact that outside of what seems like fitness and nutrition, calories and shit seems like a fad. Or I think people perceive it as a fad, which is like, I don't know, mind-blowingly scary to me. It's like, shit, we had a slide. I've said this like a billion times. We've had a slide about treating obesity. Not once on the fucking slide do we have anything to do with calories. Nothing at all. Like, the word calorie, and it's like, okay, this is not to tell the people how to manage their own obesity. This is to the practitioners. It's like, if the practitioner does not understand calories, that's fucking crucial. It's like, it's just like ridiculous. I don't know. I can't fucking comprehend it. It's just, I don't know, man. It's like, okay, we're one of the best universities in the world for this shit, and we can't get it. So how the fuck is the general public or like One News gonna like make this shit? Like, how are they gonna say the right shit? It's like, fuck. Like, I don't know. It is just, it's mind blowing that it seems like there's such a small percentage of us that actually have looked into it enough to realize calories is the fucking problem.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's mind-boggling. Like, I don't know. It's definitely. I just can't comprehend it though. It's to me. It's like. I want this. I want things to change, and we all do. But it's just like, how come at the best universities we can't get that knowledge across? Do you, like when you talk to people from other universities, or even people who aren't in our like little niche of evidence based? Do you feel as though people like, where the fuck is the skepticism coming from? Like, that's what blows my mind.
I don't think it's so much skepticism as much as it is just fucking confusion. From the last sort of 5 to 10 years of propagation of fad diets, unfounded diets, by the media, by some fucking Instagram celebrity who's got 200,000 followers, who looks good, who's probably taking drugs, who says this is the secret to how I look like this. And people are just getting bombarded in 30 different directions, from low carb's good, low fat's good, vegan's good, paleo's good, insert any fucking diet in there is good, is the best. And a lot of these diets have like reasonable rationales. Like if you found someone who'd never heard about a diet and you explained the paleo diet to them, with the potential benefits, they'd be like, fuck, paleo diet's the best diet that I should be on. Like, all these diets, like on face value, they have a decent rationale, but often people are just missing these massive principles, and I think it's going to be a really hard one to fix. The only thing that keeps me slightly positive is that sort of we've just seen this growth in the evidence-based community. Sort of like when I started my studies, and I sort of this linkage between sort of people who had decent social media followings and were putting out research as well. It was just these really fucking smart dudes doing research. No one knew who they were. They didn't have, maybe they had a Twitter and they were just pumping out the studies. Like, there was no connect between sort of administering the research to journals versus administering it to sort of Instagram, Facebook, or whatever. Yeah. Now there seems to be less of a disconnect, and like you can go and find guys like Lane Norton who have 250,000 followers and they have a PhD and they're involved in research. So that's the only thing that keeps me slightly positive, because 5 years ago there weren't people who had established social media followings involved in research. It just wasn't happening, and unless you were digging through journals at home in your bedroom on PubMed, you just wouldn't be exposed to this sort of information. You just get exposed to like the Ziz bullshit and like insert any other sort of non-evidence based physique person that was sort of established themselves as a professional in the fitness industry somehow, and for some reason felt that they had a voice to tell everyone else what to do.
Yeah, it's mind-blowing now that we have like Helms just past 100K. It's like, fuck yeah. It's like shit like that. Like, I don't know how many followers, but I think Jeff Nippard's at like over 1 million. It's like, thank fuck. Like that is the... Yeah,
that's the glimmer of hope. Yeah.
And it's like, I don't know. Like, I was talking with Danny yesterday, how much can we change the perception of the public through education? And he was skeptical. And I don't know, it's like, this is like the one place where it's like, this could be the caveat. Like, I see less and maybe it's just my friends talk to me a lot. So obviously if they say some really dumb shit, I'll correct them. But it's like, I don't know. I'm seeing the people that I'll meet, they'll say some dumb shit, but it's not that bad. Like, you know, it's not mind-numbingly terrible, which I guess is, that's always a good thing.
I think it's improving. Like, I'll do maybe a controversial study review post or something like that, and like now I'm seeing that like some people ask like valid questions, and now some of my followers are answering the questions, and they're answering it in a really good way, like in an informed way, and it's like, these are just dudes fucking like they don't have any university accreditation or anything like that. They're just keeping up to date with the science because now it's more sort of readily accessible through social media and whatnot, and they're becoming more informed. And so that I see things like that, and it's like, okay, well maybe we are getting somewhere.
Yeah, I fucking hope so. Like I don't know, it's there's a lot of like glimmers of hope and like because I think it's dangerous going down the path of being like, fuck, we're fucked. Because, like, education for sure is getting better, but, I mean, the situation might not be, but it's like, we had to wait for education to catch up, hopefully. I don't know. We'll see. But, yeah. Should we touch on one last thing before we finish off? So, in terms of once someone's lost the weight, what do you see as some decent strategies to help keep it off, or what are the common like key points that we really need to drill home there in terms of someone not regaining 90% of the weight again?
Okay, I'll try and keep this real simple and concise so people can get takeaways. Number one would be keep regular physical activity high post-diet. If you weren't doing it during the diet, then certainly start it post-diet. If you were already previously doing it, continue it into the post-diet phase. Having a high intake of low GI, high fiber carbs continued throughout the post-diet phase. Making sure that the person or the client has a supportive environment around them. That's probably a huge factor that's probably not discussed too much. Now, that can come from family, that can come from friends, that can come from you as the coach. Accountability from the coach also helps in a big way. If you're a coach and you're working with an overweight patient for 20 weeks and they lose a bunch of weight and then they decide they don't want to pay you anymore and then you just leave them to their own devices, that's probably a recipe for disaster and rapid weight gain. So continue the sort of the interactions and relationships with your coach, and if you're not feeling supported, contact someone. I think that obesity can be an extremely lonely issue in some circumstances, and one that some people are not comfortable speaking with, and sort of I think it gets exacerbated when it's tried to deal with yourself. So ensuring you've got support coming from elsewhere is probably a huge factor. You also want to continue to limit intake of the high energy dense micronutrient poor foods, so sugar sweetened soft drinks and juices and things like that, which, like I said before, nothing inherently fattening about them. They're just not very good for managing the appetite, and they're highly energy dense. Another one would be to sort of keep those self-monitoring practices in place. So if you were doing measurements or girths or something like that, keep doing them. Maybe not do them as frequently as you're doing post-diet phase, but maybe do them once a month or every 3 in your mind that you have some account coming up. Now, the psychological body image transition can be a little bit more complex. And this goes back to where having the support network really helps. It also helps to when you're using sort of these self-monitoring practices, make sure you're using objective monitoring, like girths and skin folds, instead of subjective assessment like mirror shots or something like that. I actually encourage most struggling with post-diet weight gain to avoid mirrors altogether. Right. And if people are more interested, in some of these strategies, I'd encourage them to read some of the work by Jake Lenardin. He's probably the specialist in this area. Yeah. And I think that's probably, if more interested, go look at Jake's work. But I think that's probably a pretty decent summary for at least mitigating most of the risk of rapid weight gain post-diet.
And if you're interested to find Jake, search Break Binge Eating on Instagram. So, yeah, very, very cool. I would love to have a chat with him at some point. It's cool because like that stuff is like, I feel like once you end it, that's the fucking crucial period. Like that is the time when, if we want to make chronic change, that's when. Like that is the damn time point. But yeah, we'll finish up here. So, Jackson, where can people find you? Do you have any products coming out? Can people find coaching, etc., etc.?
So I'm going to be doing some online coaching for JPS shortly. So if you guys aren't familiar with JPS, it's JPS Health and Fitness on the internet and Instagram. I can also be contacted for client coaching directly. You just can email me at jackson.peos@research.uwa.edu.au or just through Instagram. I'm most active on Instagram, just at Jackson Peos. And I've got a few studies coming out that'll be sort of coming out in the next 12 months. So if you want to keep up to date with those, they'll be on my research gate.
Hey guys, thank you very much for listening to this episode. I hope you give us a review or you really enjoyed the episode. Let me know any feedback. I'm always open to any criticism, anything like that. Reach out to me on Instagram at James_Walsham. Or if you'd like to follow my business account, follow at the Hypertrophy Hub. Thank you guys so much for listening. If you would like to help the show, there's a list of ways to do so in the show notes, but if you're wondering how, the best thing to do is just give us a review on iTunes or just let me know how the show can be improved. Thank you very much.